Cat Tales 24. I don't know why I called my stepfather Papa. It was probably because that's what my daughter started calling him as a child and the name stuck. Before, I'd always called him Stanley, the Americanized version of his Lithuanian name, Stanislaus. When my sister and I were 11, Stanley married our mother. He was renowned for his skill in using a boning knife in the meat packing plants that had made Sioux City, Iowa, a thriving town. We saw our stepfather as a strict, hard man. Certainly, we never imagined he'd be the sort who would love and care for a tiny cat. Long after my daughter, my husband, and I left Iowa, a neighbor approached my mother and Papa. She had a litter of kittens to get rid of. Somehow, a child had gotten hold of one and squeezed its neck so hard that the poor thing couldn't make a sound. The mute kitty was the runt of the litter. No one would take a puny kitten who couldn't even purr. The woman didn't want to kill the little thing, and wondered if Mama and Papa would consider giving her a home. No, my mother said. At the same time Papa said, sure. Misha went home with Papa, starting a love affair that extended into old age. I first saw them together when my daughter and I visited during a summer vacation. Misha, even at 5 or 6 years, was scarcely larger than Papa's huge hand. A tabby with beautiful coloring, she had hazel eyes rimmed with gold and medium-length hair. Small as she was, she had a fierce temperament and a mind of her own, both of which she displayed often, to everyone except Papa. The big, gray-haired man and the tiny, silent cat understood each other. They spoke a language that needed no sounds. To anyone who entered the house, there was never a question whose cat she was. She gave my mother the cold shoulder, a feeling my mother returned. Even with Papa, Misha wasn't the most demonstrably loving cat. He built a house for her in the yard under the front living room window, and she was happy spending her time there. She ate outside and played outside and demanded little in the way of human attention. By then, Papa had given up the packing houses to build and manage 2 apartment buildings in town. Each morning he'd leave for work, stopping first to feed and greet Misha. "Good morning, Mishila," he'd say, scratching behind her ears. She'd twist and wind around his legs, rubbing against him, craning into his fingers. He'd give her breakfast, she'd wave her tail goodbye, and he'd go off to work. Misha rarely ventured inside. Only when winter snow covered the door to her little house did she reluctantly enter the big house, and then spent most of her time on the bedside table where she could see outside. When the snow abated, she turned up her nose as well as her tail at any invitation or coaxing to remain indoors. The big house sat on a steep lot. The front was street level, with a basement apartment located down a flight of 16 concrete steps beside the house. From there, the yard dropped away on a sharp grade for another 100 yards or so. Near the bottom of the hill, an apple tree needed to be trimmed, and one spring day Papa set off to do the job. The afternoon air was still and hot. Papa walked outside and spoke to Misha with his usual mix of Lithuanian English. He dropped a spot of leftover lunch, what he called a Slobovian meal, a blend of leftover vegetables and meat mixed with ketchup, into her bowl. "I see you later, Mishila," he murmured, stroking her back. She preened under his attention, looked up with big eyes, and licked her chops. Then, as usual, she turned back to her own world. Papa retrieved a saw from the back of his truck and hefted a ladder onto his shoulder. Jostling the ladder into a comfortable position, he headed for the backyard. The row of bushes hiding the neighbor's yard was full of white, bridal wreath flowers, and roses bloomed on the strip of land leading to the stairs. Roses and peonies formed islands of color and scent in the backyard near the clotheslines. He ignored the bees flitting from bloom to bloom as well as the nodding heads of pansies and petunias along the back of the house. In his mind, he'd already climbed the tree and planned how to trim the dead branches and where to stack the brush. He was used to working alone, even when the job involved danger. It never would have occurred to him that no one was home or that the tree would be hidden from street view. He gave no credence to the opinion that a man who'd reached his 60s had no business climbing trees or easing out onto limbs weakened by age and weather. Call a professional? What for? This, taking care of his own place, his own business, is what he did, what he'd always done. It was quiet at the bottom of the hill. A thick stand of lilacs along with a variety of other bushes and trees blocked noise from the next street down, and the road on which Mama and Papa's house sat was too far off for noise. The latter made a thunk when Papa dropped the top against the solid trunk of the apple. He pulled the ladder's feet away from the base of the tree and then shook it to make sure it was steady and firm. He looked up through the branches to the sun far overhead, barely discernible through the limbs, thick with leaves. He spotted the first area of deadwood about 10 feet up. Focused only on the knowledge that the work had to be done, he grabbed the saw handle and climbed up. How long had he been at it? An hour? 2? He swept his arm across his forehead, letting his shirt sleeve soak up the sweat that had beaded his face and run into his eyes. Since starting work, he'd scrambled another 5 or 6 feet higher. Heat spiraled up through the branches. Papa's breath came heavy. He sat back and examined the amount of work left. Wiping his brow again, he decided to keep at it a little longer and then stop, finished or not. Scooting out, he expertly gripped the limb with his knees. He sawed, then leaned back to kick the wood off the branch and to the ground. Sweat dripped into his eyes. Heat swamped him. Before he knew what was happening, he slipped. He tried to release the saw, but couldn't seem to let go. His free hand sought purchase on the bark, but the branch was too thick. His leg hit a limb, his arm scraped another, knocking the saw from his hand. He fell nearly 16 feet, landing on his right leg and then hitting the ground hard with his arm and head. Mercifully, he blacked out. When he opened his lids, soft hazel eyes peered into his. Why Misha had come to find him or how she knew to, he didn't know. She nudged his forehead with her nose and licked his face. He took a breath and then took stock. Shifting his right leg sent waves of pain roiling through him. Spots danced before his eyes. Misha patted his cheek with her paws and stared at him with intent. He fought nausea. Not only were his leg, foot, and ankle useless, he'd also rolled farther down the hill when he fell and had no way to get to help except to crawl his way up to the house. He pulled himself a few feet. Tears competed with the sweat pouring down his face before he passed out again. When he woke, the sun beat down on his back and Misha's raspy little tongue was bathing his face. She bent her head and nudged his forehead. With superhuman strength stemming from the knowledge that he wouldn't be found for hours unless he moved, Papa clawed several yards uphill before giving up consciousness. Once again, when he came to, Misha was there, licking the sweat from his face and imparting her own brand of silent encouragement. Wake up. Move. Climb. Several times more, Papa crawled and passed out on his slow ascent to the house. Each time, the little cat was there, letting him know he wasn't alone. The tiny, quiet animal kept him going. Up the hill, up the steep flight of concrete steps, along the sidewalk, and up more steps into the house, Misha never left his side. For some reason, Papa called my mother at work instead of an ambulance. She couldn't drive, so her boss brought her to the house, where they found a ferocious Misha sitting on an unconscious Papa's chest. The little cat turned tiger, bristling, arching her back, and swiping, claws out, ready to fight anyone or anything who might harm the vulnerable man. Only when she was convinced they were there to help did she relinquish her defensive position. Though not as devastating as they could have been, Papa's injuries were extensive, a concussion and 5 broken bones in his right leg, foot, and ankle. He'd worsened the damage greatly by dragging himself up the hill and into the house, but again, not as much as he could have. Regardless, Papa was convinced he would have died lying under the big apple tree at the bottom of the hill had it not been for Misha. A few years later, when Papa wasn't nearly old enough but when Misha was long past her prime, he died unexpectedly. The night after his burial, a clear June evening, Misha tapped at the front door and sat patiently. I let her in. She wandered from room to room. I lifted her onto Papa's bed, which she explored for a while, and then she went to the door and waited to be let out. The next morning a neighbor came to tell Mama that the cat was dead in her yard. I buried her under a peony bush under the front window of their house. Papa rescued Misha when she was a young, damaged kitten. She returned the favor many years later by giving Papa the strength and encouragement he needed to save himself. When Papa was forced to let go of life, so did the cat he loved. Misha, the silent little tabby with the heart of a tigress, lived her life well. I think Papa did too. Very well, indeed.